In Nazi-occupied Poland, the cold killed faster than bullets. By January 1943, temperatures dropped below -20, and families had nothing left to burn. Coal was rationed to factories, wood was confiscated by soldiers, and the wind didn't care whose side you were on. Yet in the silence of frozen villages, smoke still curled from chimneys. Built not with fuel, but with forgotten skill. We think of warmth as a convenience. Turn the dial, wait a moment, and the furnace obeys. But when the power went out and the truck stopped running, heat became something else entirely. A daily battle, a ritual, a secret passed down in whispers. These people didn't survive winter with machines. They did it with trench stoves made of mud, with salt barrels that trapped warmth, with soot-pressed logs and hay-packed ovens. It wasn't innovation. It was an inheritance. Because when every resource failed, the only heat left was human knowledge. You're about to uncover 10 forgotten WWII heating techniques that worked without electricity, without fuel, and without failure. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the skills our ancestors never wanted us to forget. Number 1. Trench stoves built from mud and scrap metal. In the ruins of Eastern Europe, when factories lay silent and homes were reduced to rubble, people built fire from the ground itself. The trench stove wasn't a machine. It was an act of necessity. Born in bombed-out alleys, refugee camps, and the frostbitten woods where soldiers and civilians shared the same cold. With coal diverted to military trains and forests stripped bare by retreating armies, heating became an improvised art. In villages across Ukraine, Belarus, and occupied Poland, families scraped together what little remained. Rusted sheet metal from abandoned tanks, broken bricks from collapsed buildings, even the clay beneath their feet. They dug narrow trenches in the earth, lined them with mud bricks, and fashioned chimneys from scavenged tin. With a single match and a fistful of twigs, they could warm an entire pot of food, or a single pair of hands. These trench stoves worked not by strength, but by simplicity. The narrow design focused airflow, allowing small amounts of fuel to burn hot and clean. Heat rose directly into cooking pots or radiated out into earthen walls, which stored warmth long after the fire had died. At night, families would crowd around these makeshift hearths, the orange glow flickering off hollow eyes and frostbitten fingers. They didn't speak much. The fire was doing enough, didn't steal the flame. There were no blueprints, only memory. Passed from one shivering hand to another. Soldiers on both sides used the same technique in frontline trenches. It wasn't about comfort, it was survival without smoke. A low-profile fire meant warmth without detection. In some partisan camps, these trench stoves became a lifeline, hidden beneath brush and earth, burning silently while planes passed overhead. By the end of the war, the trench stove had traveled farther than many refugees. From the Baltics to the Balkans, it was built in barns, basements, and battered train cars. And even after the guns fell silent, some families kept using them, not from nostalgia, but because they still worked. This wasn't engineering. It was instinct turned to flame. This wasn't just survival, it was memory passed down in silence. Number 2. Haybox heating chambers. In wartime, Britain, when coal was rationed and gas was scarce, warmth became something you had to trap, not generate. And so, in cottages across the countryside and cramped kitchens in London's blackout zones, a quiet revolution took place. It didn't roar like a fire. It whispered like wool. They called it the haybox. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a wooden crate stuffed with straw or old blankets. But inside that crude insulation lay a wartime miracle: passive heat, captured and extended. The method was simple but brilliant. A pot of stew or porridge would be brought to a boil over a brief flame, then removed, sealed, and nestled deep inside the haybox. The trapped heat would continue cooking the meal slowly, sometimes for hours, without burning another ounce of fuel. But the haybox wasn't just for food. Families learned to use it as a secondary source of warmth. The heated pot, wrapped and enclosed in straw, radiated gentle heat into the room, safe, smokeless, and nearly invisible. In children's bedrooms, it became a bedtime ritual. A pot placed in a haybox near the bed meant no breath would freeze on the pillow. These improvised thermal chambers became a staple in households from Yorkshire to Cornwall. They were cheap to make, silent to run, and required nothing but leftover fabric, patience, and a pot with a lid. Even government pamphlets urged women to build them, praising their ability to cut fuel usage in half. In some cases, multiple hayboxes were used at once, rotated throughout the day to stagger meals and maintain warmth from morning through night. During the Blitz, as firewood disappeared and windows shattered, hayboxes kept the warmth alive, tucked away in corners like humble sentinels. Soldiers returning home on leave would often find their families gathered around them, sharing meals that had cooked without flame. The science was simple, thermal retention through dense insulated layering, but the impact was human. Elderly parents stayed warm without risk of open fire. Infants were kept safe in rooms where heat still lingered, long after the pot had cooled. It wasn't convenient, it was clever. A way to stretch warmth just a little longer when every flame mattered. They didn't just heat food, they preserved comfort. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 3, dung and ash logs. In the countryside of the Balkans, across rural Germany, and deep into Soviet territory, winters came with a bitter truth. There would be no firewood. Occupation, bombing, and retreating armies had left entire forests razed. The timber was gone, and so was the coal. What remained was the earth, and what animals left behind. Families turned to what modern minds would never consider fuel: dung, straw, and desperation. Dried animal waste, when shaped properly, could burn hot and slow. Mixed with straw, sawdust, or even shredded cloth, it formed combustible bricks. But the real ingenuity came from those who blended dung with sifted ash, the leftovers of yesterday's fire. This made each new log cleaner, more compact, and less smoky. The ash added density and trapped air, allowing it to burn more like coal than flame. Mothers and children spent afternoons forming these logs by hand. They'd press the mixture into wooden molds or simply pack it tight into old bread pans. Then came the drying, on rooftops, near ovens, or beside windows where the winter sun still peeked through. Each log took days to harden, but once dried, it could burn for hours. There was no fragrance of pine or crackle of oak. The fire these bricks gave off was quiet, low, and earthy. But it was reliable. And in a world without choices, reliability was everything. These fuel bricks became common in Serbian villages, Hungarian farms, and German refugee camps. In Poland, some communities used public bathhouses to dry them en masse. They called them black bread, and for many, they were just as vital. Using waste as fuel wasn't new, but in wartime, it became refined. Families learned how to balance moisture, add insulating material, and stack the logs to maximize airflow. The technique passed through the whispers, barter, and quiet observation. Few ever wrote it down. It wasn't something to be proud of, but it worked. At night, a single dung and ash log in a trench stove could mean the difference between frozen silence and a chance to dream. This fire came not from forests, but from function. Not from power, but from patience. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 4, brick bed warmers and stone storage heat. In the unheated bedrooms of wartime France, warmth was a ritual carved into stone. Not from a furnace, not from firewood, but from a brick, pulled from the embers and wrapped in cloth. This was the bed warmer, a silent companion of those who slept in barns, cellars, and the upper floors of houses left to freeze. When fuel was too scarce to keep fires burning through the night, families learned to store heat during the day and release it slowly while they slept. The technique was simple but practiced with care. A brick, stone, or even a chunk of cast iron would be placed in or near the cooking fire. Once heated through, it was carefully removed using tongs or rags, wrapped in thick cloth or old garments, and tucked between bed linens. Some placed them at the foot of the bed. Others laid them beside the torso. In harsh winters, families would heat multiple bricks and rotate them across the room, passing them from hand to hand like torches of borrowed sun. The warmth didn't last long, a few hours at most. But in those early moments of sleep, when the cold bit was the hardest, it was enough. In villages along the Loire and in occupied Czech towns, this method became a nightly ritual. Children were taught how to test the heat without burning themselves. Old women stitched thick sleeves out of wool to keep the bricks from scorching sheets. Nothing was wasted. Not warmth, not wisdom. During power outages and curfews, the glow of a brick beneath a blanket meant more than comfort. It meant continuity. It meant that even without coal, without light, without certainty, there was still warmth to be found. Some families placed the bricks beneath dining tables during meals. Others kept them inside shoes or boots overnight, preventing frostbite before the morning walk to forage or queue for rations. The science was simple: thermal mass. Dense material absorbs heat, holds it, and radiates it back slowly. But the meaning was deeper. These weren't just stones. They were heat made portable, reusable, and deeply personal. They didn't warm the house. They warmed the heart of the bed. It wasn't survival. It was defiance in silence. Number 5. Russian peasant stove walls, pechka. Across the frozen plains of western Russia, where winter came early and left late, homes were built not around furniture, but around fire. In every rural cottage from Smolensk to Siberia stood the heart of the house, the pechka, a massive masonry stove, part oven, part bed, part lifeline. It didn't just heat the room, it became the room. Unlike modern metal stoves, which lose heat the moment the flame dies, the pechka was built with layers of brick and stone that absorbed fire all day and released warmth all night. It stood in the center of the home like a monument, thick, slow, and dependable. With a single burn each morning, it radiated steady heat for over 24 hours. Families cooked on it, dried clothes on it, and most importantly, slept on it. The top of the stove was built flat, large enough to fit a sleeping child or a weary grandparent. During wartime, when fuel was scarce and windows were broken by blast waves, the pechka became more than a stove. It was a refuge. Children curled up on warm stones while snow blew through the cracks. In some villages, babies were placed in makeshift cradles set directly atop the stove. Boots were dried beside the ash drawer. Meat was smoked in its upper chamber. A single structure fulfilling every function, because nothing else was coming. During the harshest years of the German invasion, when trains stopped running and armies devoured every scrap of coal, the pechka held its ground. Even when homes were shelled or half buried in snow, if the stove stood, the family stood with it. Construction was a skill passed from father to son. The design varied by region, but the principles remained: slow combustion, thick mass, and smart airflow. Wood was burned in quick, hot bursts, then sealed off to let the stone do the rest. In some households, even furniture was built around it: benches, shelves, sleeping platforms, turning heat into architecture. The pechka didn't rely on pipes, fans, or pressure gauges. It answered only to the match and the mason. Even today, some Russian villagers still use it. Not for nostalgia, but for the simple reason that nothing works better. When the war ended and fuel returned, many still chose to light one match a day and let the bricks do the rest. There was no plan B, only adaptation. Number 6. Salt and sand barrels for thermal mass. In the war-torn cities of Hungary and Poland, where blackout curtains fluttered against broken windows and the air bit through every crack, families turned to stillness to create warmth. Not through burning, through storing. And in corners of cold rooms, simple barrels filled with salt or sand did what no fire could. They held the heat long after the flames were gone. The method came from practicality, not theory. When fuel was scarce, stoves were lit only once a day, sometimes less. That single burst of heat had to last. And it could, if there was something heavy, dense, and dry to absorb it. Salt and sand were ideal. Both materials have high thermal mass, meaning they absorb heat slowly and release it even slower. Families filled wooden or metal barrels with dry sand or coarse rock salt and placed them beside their stoves or ovens. As the fire roared, these barrels drank in the warmth. Hours later, when the fire had died and the room began to chill, the barrels continued to radiate gentle heat, enough to stave off frostbite or silence a child's shivering. In some cases, the barrels were wrapped in wool or lined with stone to retain even more warmth. Others were placed beneath benches or used to warm bedding laid on top. For families living in basements, attics, or barns, they became silent sentinels. Warm to the touch long after the fire had faded. No smoke, no sound. Just heat, borrowed and returned. The technique spread quietly among civilians. In Krakow, it was taught in orphanages. In Budapest, it was shared between widows in bombed-out tenements. Even partisans hiding in mountain cabins used the method, burying heated stones in sand to make makeshift heaters that lasted through the night. The science was unspoken, but understood. Mass equals memory, at least when it comes to heat. And in a world where power lines were cut and gas lines ran dry, storing warmth was just as vital as creating it. These weren't high-tech solutions. They were humble ones. Silent barrels filled with the Earth's most basic materials, standing guard against the cold. They didn't spark. They didn't flicker. But they stayed warm when nothing else could. Tech fails, but this method never did. Number 7. Burning books, furniture, and family heirlooms. But there was one method no one wanted to speak about. Not because it didn't work, but because it asked too much. When every other fuel was gone, when the woods had been stripped, and even dung bricks had turned to ash, some families turned inward. not to their pantries, but to their memories. They began to burn their own past. In the winter of 1944, as the siege of Leningrad dragged into its final bitter months, entire apartments were gutted from the inside, not by bombs, but by desperation. Grand pianos, family chests, wedding dresses, carved bed frames passed down for generations, reduced to firewood, each spark a fragment of identity, sacrificed to stay alive one more night. In Warsaw, children were sent to strip wallpaper for kindling. Books were torn page by page and fed into stoves. Not just textbooks or novels, but prayer books, cookbooks, journals. In Prague, a Jewish woman wrote by candlelight that she had just burned her wedding canopy. She ended the note with one sentence: "It was warm." These were not careless acts. They were rituals of grief. Families chose carefully. What could go, what must remain. Often, the most ornate items were burned first, not because they were hated, but because they burned best. Even photographs, frozen moments of faces long gone, were sometimes used as kindling. There are stories of men hesitating with a match in hand, staring at the faces of their mothers or brothers before watching them curl into flame. These fires did not warm just the body. They burned through silence, pride, and dignity. Each piece fed into the stove was a trade: a chair for another day, a shelf for a night of sleep, a cradle for a few hours of peace. In Berlin, as Soviet troops approached and the final winter set in, furniture was dismantled systematically. Table legs chopped, headboards turned to kindling, wardrobes disappeared, one panel at a time. Some burned their last heirlooms not to survive, but to die warm. This wasn't a technique passed down. It was a decision no one wanted to teach, and everyone hoped never to repeat. But in that silence, there was still something sacred. Even in the act of burning their past, people held to the idea that life, if only briefly, was worth preserving. They burned yesterday to see tomorrow. Now you understand why survival in World War II wasn't powered by machines. It was powered by memory. Heat didn't come from thermostats or fuel lines. It came from stone, salt, ash, and sacrifice. Families didn't just endure the cold. They outsmarted it, outlasted it, and in the quietest ways, they defied it. These weren't emergency measures. They were everyday rituals. A brick wrapped in cloth, a stove built from mud, a barrel of sand placed beside the fire. Each one carried the weight of centuries, techniques passed down, not written down, and in the hardest years, they kept entire generations alive. Modern prepping tells us to store batteries and generators, but what if all you had was earth, fire, and a little human resolve? What if the real tools of survival were already around you, just waiting to be remembered? These methods worked without power, without fuel, without fail. And maybe, one day, they'll need to work again. Help bring these lessons back into our world. Subscribe and stay prepared.